Hello, I'm Diarmid Campbell. I am the developer of the video game Wired. As well as being a fun game in its own right, Wired has a strong educational thread running through it. And by playing the game, you develop a pretty deep understanding of the fundamentals of electricity and electrical circuits. In this video, I'm going to talk about the educational underpinnings of the game. But before we go any further, let's have a look at the trailer video for the game so you have some idea of what I'm talking about.
Yes, what is it? I'm right in the middle of... It's you.
Hello, I'm Alexander Moravian. I'm the man who's making this place.
Oh, you're inside the school. That's a bit annoying. For you.
Madness. This just requires a little bit of thinking about. Is Wired an educational game? Yes. So it's definitely an educational game. But I'm trying not to label it as an educational game. And the reason for this is that educational games have a sort of quite rightly deserved reputation for not being very fun. And the reason for this is that most educational games are designed to be delivered through the classroom. So they've kind of got a captive audience, and to be successful, they only need to be a bit more fun than the lesson they would be replacing. So that sort of fun threshold that they need to reach to be successful is considerably lower than it is for any other kind of game. So Wired was conceived differently. We wanted to teach something that people might find difficult at school to show that, actually you can do this stuff. But crucially, we wanted to show that solving engineering problems is genuinely fun. And it is. It's like it's fun being an engineer. So the goal was to create a game which was not delivered through the classroom, but instead was delivered through gaming websites that people could choose to play if they wanted to. So in order to be successful, it needs to be at least as fun as other games that people might choose to play. So from the very beginning, all the way through development, we've just been asking, is it fun? Is it fun? Is it fun? Because fundamentally, it doesn't matter how educational it is. If it isn't fun, then people are not going to play it. Why electricity? Well, electricity is all around us. It's a massive part of the modern world, and most people don't understand how it works. And this isn't just your average man or woman on the street. A huge number of people who study A-level physics come away from that not understanding electricity. And I was one of those people. And it's just hard. It's a tricky thing to understand. But with the right explanations, a bit of motivation and a bit of practice, most people should be able to get their heads around this stuff. Why do people have so much trouble with electricity? Well, some physical phenomena we have very direct experience of and have done ever since we were kids. This means that when we do come to learn the equations, for example, behind Newton's laws of motion, we already have a very, very strong intuition about how the objects behave within the system, and that helps really guide us in how to apply the equations. But electricity is invisible, and we don't tend to encourage our kids to go off and play with it. And as a result, people simply don't have that intuition. Now, when you get to a physics class, often you're told that, well, electricity, it just behaves a bit like water in pipes, so think of it like that. And people go, oh, right, yeah, great. And then they quickly realise that actually they don't really understand how water in pipes flows either, other than the fact that it does flow. I mean, how many people could tell you why the shower changes temperature when somebody flushes the toilet elsewhere in the house? I can explain what's tricky about electricity by using a circuit diagram. Now, if you've never seen a circuit diagram before, don't worry. Just follow along and I think you'll still get the gist. So we have a battery here, and it's a 1 volt battery, in fact, and it's connected up to 3 bulbs. Now, these bulbs happen to be of 1 ohm resistance, but that's not so important. And these bulbs will be happily glowing away. And then suppose that one of them, this one, blows. In this case, this is going to leave a gap in the circuit here. And the question is, do the remaining bulbs get brighter or darker due to this one blowing? So this seems like it's a fairly simple sounding problem, and you'd probably expect that anyone who understood electricity would just be able to go, oh, well, obviously the answer is bleh. But actually, it's not that obvious. And at school, we're taught to solve this kind of problem by writing out a whole load of equations and doing some algebra. And that will get you to the solution. But it's not fun in the way that I'm really looking for when making a game. So there is an alternative representation of circuits that was developed by a researcher called Peter Cheng at the University of Sussex, and this is called AVOW diagrams. Now, in an AVOW diagram, each component, in this case the bulbs, are represented by a rectangle, where the width of the rectangle represents the current flowing through the component, and the height of the rectangle represents the voltage across it. Now, if, like most people, you don't know what voltage and current are, don't worry about it. You just need to be aware that they are 2 quantities that we tend to be very interested in when trying to understand what's going on in a circuit. Now, in our example, we don't know what the voltage and current are for this component, but we do know that it's a 1 ohm bulb, and so we can use something called Ohm's law to tell us that actually the voltage and the current will have the same value. So in our example, the AVOW diagram for this component will actually be a square, because the voltage will equal the current. But we don't know how big this square is. So now we can add in the other 2 bulbs, and these will also be squares because they're also 1 ohm, and they get stacked up according to how they're wired up. So something like this. And again, we just don't know how big any of these squares are yet. So now we need to apply the rules of electricity. Now, conventionally, these rules are framed in terms of equations that need to be solved. But in the language of AVOW diagrams, they become very visual rules. For example, the pattern of rectangles needs to be a very specific height. Also, the pattern of rectangles should itself form a rectangle without any gaps. So we need to adjust the sizes of these squares to conform with these rules. And when we do that, we end up with this pattern. And we can then do the same with the circuit diagram for after the bulb has blown. And this is just two bulbs which end up being two squares on top of one another. Well, now we can look at the top bulb on the left. And we can say, well, this one started off as a small square and became a bigger square. So the top bulb got brighter, and the bottom bulb started off as a large square, which then got smaller, so the bottom bulb got darker. So using these AVOW diagrams, we can solve this kind of problem without having to write down any equations or do any algebra. But actually, AVOW diagrams are much more powerful than this. Let's look at the top pattern again. Now we know that the height of the pattern is representing the voltage across the circuit, which we know is 1 volt because we've got a 1 volt battery. So if we know that this height is 1 volt, and we can see that these squares are half the height of this square, then we can immediately see that the top squares must have 1/3 of a volt across them, and the bottom square must have 2/3 of a volt. And because the bottom one is square, we know that it has 2/3 of an amp, which is the measurement of current flowing through it. And similarly, we can look at the bottom diagram as well. So AVOW diagrams also allow us to get a quantitative understanding of these key concepts. And these diagrams form an integral part of this strategy for explaining electricity within the game Wired. Right, let's see how Wired pulls all these threads together. I've dropped us in a little bit of a way into the game, and we control this character, and she can run and jump and climb ladders. And she also encounters these old cine screens which play films. So, we meet again. The thing below me, with the glowy bits on, is called a fuel cell. And the thing over there, on the table, well, that's called a terminal. You can use the terminal to wire up the fuel cell to other things in the building. But the first thing I want you to do is to wire the fuel cell up to itself, like this. Okay, well, let's do that. So we go to the terminal, we enter wiring mode, and then now we have this hand which lets us pick out these wires from the connectors on the top and bottom, and we can connect the fuel cell up to itself. Congratulations, you've managed to wire the fuel cell up to itself. Now this has created something called a short circuit. Now you might be feeling quite pleased with yourself, But actually, this is a really bad thing to do. It's going to burn out all my equipment. So, I know I asked you to do it, but don't do it again, please. You can unplug it to stop the terrible noise, and then go through to the next room. So there's a little bit of hand-holding while the player learns the user interface. And then we encounter our first problem, which is that there's this door blocking our way. So we need to find a terminal. Here we are. So this time we're going to wire the fuel cell up to the door. And as soon as it connects, the electricity starts flowing. And that lets us get through the room. So after we've done a few of this kind of puzzle, we cement the knowledge that the player has learnt. The thing you can see flowing through the wires is called charge. Now, charge is like a fluid, and it flows like water. It can flow slowly, like it is now, or it can flow really quickly, like like when you made that short circuit earlier, which I asked you to do, so that's fine. Charge, it flows through the wires like water. Now, as we jump to a little bit further on in the game, the puzzles become a bit more sophisticated. So in this case, we've got to get through this door here, but there isn't a fuel cell in this area. We need to go all the way up here to find a fuel cell. And the terminals only let us wire things up in a particular area that's coloured a bit orange. So I can't get these wires out of this room. So I need to figure out how to route the electricity through the different rooms to power the door. And this is an important lesson because a vital concept in the idea of electricity is the idea of a circuit. And this setup allows for lots of opportunity to set up the circuit incorrectly. For example, if I were to just wire it across here, we can see we would get a short circuit if I let go. Okay, so that's not the way to do it. So here the player really has to work to create a circuit which helps them understand what a circuit is. In this room, we need to get through this door. But we can see that as soon as we open it, our exit gets blocked by it. But there's no other terminals around here to let us disconnect it once we're up there. So instead we have to use this switch. Now the switch can be activated from the terminal where I am now, or we can physically pull it when we're at the switch as well. So after people have got the hang of basic switches, we encounter this kind of problem. So here we have a door blocking our path, so that can be got out of the way, but again we need to get up here and around here and it's blocking our exit, so we put it through a switch. But this switch actually has 3 connectors on it, allowing us to reroute the flow of charge to other machines. And in fact, in this case, we're going to get out of here, but then our exit is going to be blocked by this door. So we need to be able to power that one up as well. an important element of the game is that we try not to tell the player what they need to do, but instead let them explore and discover it for themselves. So in this room, this is the first time that the player needs to connect 2 machines up to 1 fuel cell. But we've laid it out to give them a pretty big hint what they need to do. And then we have almost the same puzzle, but just laid out slightly less intuitively. And then, again, slightly less intuitively again. And once the player discovers something, gets a little better practice, then we can introduce a film which really attempts to cement the knowledge. You can wire more than 1 machine up to a fuel cell. If you let the current flow out of 1 machine and into another. This is called wiring machines up in series. So you may have noticed the professor on the cine screen looked a little bit different. Basically he's growing older, and he gets older and older as you make your way through the building. Something else I want to point out is that the dominant representation of electricity that we've seen so far has been these blobs in the wires, and the speed that they move at is the current, and the size of the blobs is the voltage at that point in the circuit. However, there is another representation going on here. So if I just connect 1 machine up to the fuel cell, there is this great big square here that we call a power square, which shows how much power is being delivered to the machine. And that same power square is displayed inside the fuel cell. Now if I wire 2 machines up in series, their power squares inside the fuel cell are placed on top of each other, and in order to fit, they need to be made smaller. And so this is why these machines have smaller power squares, and they're getting less power and they're moving more slowly. So again, moving further on up the school, the player has now got used to wiring things up in series. They'll be familiar with the fact that the machines get less power and move more slowly when they do this. But then this starts to become a crucial part of the puzzles. So let's have a look at this one. We've got to get out of the top right-hand corner of this room. And all right, first thing we've got to do is get past that door. So let's just do that. Okay, and then we're going to go up here. We've got to go down here and along here, but I'm going to get blocked by that door. So we need to disconnect the door. We need to connect that and make a hole for us to get through. Okay, and then we're going to have to go along here like this, and we've got to get across this gap and up to here. So to get across that gap, we're going to need to use this platform, but we've got to catch it before it reaches the top, because once it's reached the top, we can't use it to get across there. Okay, well let's wire it up to the switch. So this will give us a bit more time. So we can pull the switch and then go. Unfortunately, we were still too late. So the platform was just moving too fast. So what we actually have to do is reuse that door that that we used initially, but not as a door, but just as a means to get a bit more resistance into our circuit. Okay, now it's moving much slower, the platform has less power. So after a little while, the player starts to encounter a very different kind of puzzle. So here we have a pattern of square frames. And on the right, we can create these things called mechanical squares, and we do that by stretching a spark between 2 points. And we just have to set the squares up so it copies that pattern. Now, these mechanical squares are, in fact, AVOW diagrams. So, let's just muck around with it a bit to give you a feel of how they behave. So you can just add and remove these squares, and they always change size in order to tessellate and make sure there aren't any gaps. So for example, we can set things up like that problem I talked about before we started looking at the game, where we had 3 bulbs connected up like this, and then this was the AVOW diagram pattern, and then if one of the bulbs blows, we can see how it changes. So by getting the player to mess around with this system, they start to get an intuitive understanding of how these shapes change when they do different things. And in fact, if you look at the blue glowy lines here, this is a circuit diagram. Okay, so eventually once you've done all of these puzzles, the wall opens up and you can walk through. So after the players become familiar with the AVOW diagrams, we then link that back to the puzzles which they're solving in the more normal rooms and explain that when you wire 2 machines up in series, it places their power squares on top of each other. And we also introduce the concept of wiring things up in parallel, which I haven't shown you in this video. And in that case, the 2 squares are placed side by side. And then they can solve this kind of puzzle. So here we have 2 platforms. And if I were to connect them up to the fuel cell, you can see that they both move at the same speed, so you'll never be able to get from this one up to that one. Instead, what we need is for this one to move slower than that one. So we can do this by putting it in series with this, which is a resistor. Okay. And then the other platform can go in parallel with both of those, and that gets the full amount of power, and that can go quickly. And you can see the AVOW diagram that has been generated inside the fuel cell. The final thing I want to show you here is a different kind of platform. So this one, if we wire it up, it goes up. But if we reverse the flow, goes down. And in fact, this kind of platform goes to a position dependent upon the size of the current flowing through it. And we can actually see the number, which is the number of amps of the current flowing through it here. So we actually need this to come down, but not quite this far. So I'm going to put it in series with a resistor, so it only comes down halfway, and we can see the readout saying a half as well. And then to get up the next bit, we need it to go up, but again, only by a half. So by introducing this sort of measuring device on the right here, we're introducing the quantitative element of current. In the demo you just saw, all of the machines had 1 ohm of resistance. And this is why all of their power squares were, well, square. And later on you encounter machines which are not 1 ohm. And similarly, all the fuel cells you saw were 1 volt fuel cells, but later on you'll get 2 volt fuel cells which you need to use. And there's a whole load of other things to mess around with, ammeters and voltmeters, fuses, so fuses which blow if too much current goes through them. And yeah, that's kind of it really. So that's Wired, the game, and it's free to play, so you can download it from Steam for free, or you can just go to wiredthegame.com and play it directly in a web browser. If you want to contact me, then you can email contact@wiredthegame.com.